Let me talk about something. What I want to talk about. I teach many courses on Wednesday, and I've started teaching this year 2 new courses, which is History of Western Philosophy and World Intellectual History. So I want to talk about that a little bit in the context of a course like this. So in general, again, I told you that we have this mechanistic versus teleological worldview, and I think that in an important sense, we are right now in the transition between teleological and mechanistic worldview. And in many ways, I'm looking for new ways of teaching philosophy within the new mechanistic worldview. So let me start somewhere. So as you know, I think it is an accurate characterization of the nature of human knowledge that human knowledge, in an important respect, is circular. That human knowledge always relies on assumptions, right? So, when you start doing philosophy, it's not clear where exactly you start doing philosophy. There's a very important phrase from Heidegger, a very important phrase for me, that we are thrown into this world, and we always already, immer schon in German, we always already find ourselves thrown into this world. We find ourselves in this situation. We haven't chosen to be in this situation. So in an important respect, I told you, right? So like when we sit down and introspect, when we close our eyes, we realize that the inside of our head points outside, because we know that we are not the causes of ourselves. And very importantly, I think that it's important to understand that thinking is not the cause of itself, but thinking, the act of human thinking is a product of something larger than ourselves. This is kind of my point zero, that we find ourselves thrown into this world. Again, the German is immer schon. Also, again, Heidegger uses this wonderful word Dasein instead of using the word subject. Dasein could be translated etymologically as being there. We find ourselves being already as parts of the situation, right? And the situation is given to us, right? Anyway, so and again, so inside points outside. And so, when I teach classes in history of philosophy, or world intellectual history, history of religion, which is also something I teach, I think it is appropriate in the 21st century to begin at least a little bit with a lesson in evolutionary biology, because the ancients might have thought that mind is superior to matter, mind generates matter. By and large, we don't think this today. It's like, do we have an apodictic proof that mind is generated by matter? No. But kind of I want to say the general structure of the sciences, of biology, of neuroscience and psychology is such that it's a very extravagant belief, I think, for highly educated people to hold in the 21st century, that somehow mind is independent of matter, right? So there's a history. There's a history of thought. Thought is not primary. Thought appears in the history of the universe at some stage, right? And so we have this grandiose story, which I will not fill in the detail, but I want to mention that the story exists, right? There's the story from the Big Bang, right? Big Bang onwards, and then the increase of entropy, And the idea is that there's this blind, mechanistic causation going on, blind, chaotic increase in entropy, blind chaos. And this blind chaos generates complexity. So blind, purposeless chaos generates complexity, gives rise to complexity. And when I say blind purposeless chaos, again, my favorite phrase is from Immanuel Kant, der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie, the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. This is the worldview that we have, I think, in the sciences in the 21st century, again, that holds together sciences from physics, bottom up, to chemistry, to biology, to psychology and the social sciences, kind of the unity of science. And so, again, the idea is that thought appears at some point. Thought and language appear at some point. Thought and language appear as results of evolution. And again, evolution, as we talked about last time, very importantly, it's important to understand, evolution is blind. So it's, you have this completely mechanistic picture. It's not trying to achieve any purpose. It just so happens that through completely random mutations, it's very important that, again, at the root of evolution, we have randomness. This kind of blind, purposeless chaos random in a stochastic sense, right? So there's a random mutation, and for completely mechanistic reasons, if this random mutation helps your lineage survive into the future, and you survive into the future by surviving yourself or by reproducing. So survival and reproduction are kind of the same thing. It's like, my body reproduces itself. It's called homeostasis. My body reproduces itself from moment to moment, from year to year. Or I could have children. And both of these are ways to sustain, to reproduce the genetic code, right? So we are gene factories. A chicken is just an egg's way of making another egg. It's a wonderful phrase due to a Nobel Prize winning biologist, Nico Tinbergen. A chicken is just an egg's way of making another egg, right? So we have this blind mechanistic evolution, and so you have all sorts of things evolving, like multicellularity evolves, or meiosis and mitosis evolve, right? Or photosynthesis evolves. And at some point, again, you'd have to take a biology class in order to understand the story in its completeness. At some point, you get the evolution of consciousness. So an evolution of internal representation. So if you imagine some kind of an organism, very simple organism that for the first time evolves something like consciousness, maybe some kind of a worm, right? So within itself, it has like a nervous system which allows it to represent the world outside, to build a mental model of the world outside, to take in information, process information, and to plan ahead. So basically, again, in this sense, in this functional definition of consciousness, there is no interesting difference between animal consciousness and computer consciousness. Your computer has a way of representing the world, and a worm has a way of representing the world. And the computer represents the world in the electrochemistry of the transistors, and the worm represents the world in the electrochemistry of the neurons. But at the end of the day, the idea is that it's the same kind of process, right? And so you get the evolution of consciousness, but then, very importantly, you get the evolution of speech, language, and, self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. And this is an interesting story. And again, I can refer to maybe Stephen Stearns or Robert Wyman, if you want, from the Yale University, if you want to check it out, or Paul Bloom. So these are just references. Or I think it's another evolutionary psychologist whose name is Ray Kurzweil. So the idea is that there's actually, as far as evolutionary psychology is concerned, there's a very scandalous reason as to why human beings have evolved speech and consciousness. So it's like I like to tell this to first-year students in the first class because, they're taking a course in philosophy. Let's talk about something very crass. And there's a bit of a Freudian motif, the low origins of high things, the low sexual origins of even such things as speech. The idea is that the basic difference between human beings and chimpanzees is that human females hide their estrus. I mean, obviously not consciously, but it's a product of random mutation. Just for completely random evolutionary reasons, it just so happens that human females, at some point, proto-human females, I should say, have evolved this mutation so that they do not know when they ovulate. They do not know when they are fertile. And because of that, the parenting strategy changes. Basically, for the chimpanzees, it pays to be strong. The strongest chimp gets most kids. But the strength means that when the female is ovulating, the alpha chimp, the alpha chimpanzee, can make sure that he gets, first in line, for mating. So it's a reliable strategy. But if you do not know when the female is ovulating, and it's true, human beings do not know when a female is ovulating. In fact, the scientists only found out in the 20th century exactly when the woman is fertile, when the human female is fertile, right? Because of that, you gotta stick with the female. Like if you're a male, you have the evolution of pair bonding. Male chimp doesn't care about the female, but the human male has to stick with the female, has to stand by her side, like for the year round, and they have to, constantly copulate, have intercourse, because they don't know. She doesn't know when she's fertile. He doesn't know when she's fertile. And the solution of just being strong enough doesn't work anymore, because you can be strong while the female is fertile, let's say once a year, but you cannot be stronger than all the other males around 365 days in a year. And so you have a different evolutionary strategy. Now it pays, so for the chimps, it pays to be stronger, and also, we talk about Freud in this class. There's competition in strength. There's also sperm competition. So chimps evolve like huge testicle sizes, and they evolve killer sperm, right? So this is the strategy that they evolve. But for humans, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you have to evolve brains and hands. Why? Because this allows you to get more calories for your children. This is going to be a more fruitful strategy of getting your genes into the next generation. This is crass and mechanistic. It's not God designed it this way or anything like that. It's not because it makes art possible. No, it is simply an evolutionary strategy. And it's a very good evolutionary strategy because it turns out that once you get this process going, human beings are terribly good at survival and reproduction. In fact, human beings, wherever they are, wherever they have found themselves, have driven all the other apes to extinction. So it's like, or into extinction or into marginal lands. I mean, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos cannot compete with human beings. This is actually, at the end of the day, it turns out a better strategy. And it has been stumbled upon for completely random evolutionary reasons, right? And so the notion is that human beings have lived as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. And by the way, if you want to learn more about this, there's a brilliant course in demography by Robert Wyman from the Open Yale courses. And he spends about 4 lectures talking about chimps, monkey sex, talking about chimps, gorillas, and human beings, early human beings in this context, from this particular perspective, right? So if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to do your own research. But then the idea is, again, we have lived as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, and you have this pair bonding, and you have this approximate, this is kind of important, you understand, I'm a political philosopher by trade. Politically speaking, hunter-gathering societies are approximately egalitarian. There's a very important political philosopher who's alive today, whose name is Francis Fukuyama. He has a recent book called Origins of Political Order. He begins his book in Origins of Political Order precisely by talking about this transition from ape to human. And the idea is that, again, these early hunter-gathering communities, in fact, to the extent that they survive even today, they're approximately egalitarian. There's approximate equality between males and females, even between elder and younger. And there are no chiefs in the sense that you can have like the elder who is most respected, most listened to, but you don't get to give commands such that other people will obey just absolutely. What you get is like strong suggestions, and you get rule by consensus. Now what happens in a very important transition, and this transition is actually foretold by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau knows nothing about evolution, but he was so insightful that he knew that this is what happens. He says that you need agriculture, metallurgy and agriculture, but especially agriculture to change things around. And basically agriculture is force multiplier. Within hunter-gathering societies, you have approximate equality. Agriculture allows the deployment of enormous amount of concentration of force and power. And notice, again, this is a very interesting story because it's very clearly bad for the individuals. If you look at bones, agriculturals are miserable. They have diseases, they live shorter lifespans, and they are physically weaker. And like if you look at their bones are of much worse quality than the bones of the hunter-gatherers. But they have something, they have strength in numbers. So anytime, this is called group selection. An individual hunter-gatherer would almost always beat an individual agricultural. Individually. But there's also group selection, because groups of hunter-gatherers will always lose to groups of agriculturals, because up until the Battle of Omdurman and the first military deployment of the machine gun, usually if you have overwhelming numbers on your side, you're going to win. Like if you are advantaged like 10-1, even if you're Hannibal, you will lose, right? You understand what I'm driving at. And so the notion is that it's a lot of things going on right now. But I want to say from the very beginning, because I think ethics are very important. The question of value is very important in this course. This idea that our values are produced by our products of biological and cultural evolution. So values are products of biological and cultural evolution. Bio plus cultural evolution. And they give rise to our values. Again, the fact that all of you and me find rotting meat disgusting and repugnant, rotting meat festering with maggots. As far as we can tell, this is hardwired into us by our biology. This is true for the vast majority of anatomically normal human beings, for a reason, for a biological reason. But then, once you get this cultural selection, group selection, you can start evolving cultural, memotypes. We talked about this. And genes genetic code can be isolated in a test tube as a DNA molecule. Cultural code is much harder to isolate, but methodologically speaking, I think we understand what we're talking about. We've got to be careful when we talk about cultural code, but at the same time, I feel that we're on firm grounds when we say that such a thing exists, right? And you can code, like you have institutions, like institutions of monarchy, for example, which don't exist in hunter-gathering societies, but now exist in agricultural societies, or, very interestingly, institutions of particular kinds of centralized, organized religion, right? And so what I'm driving at is that sometimes your biology, your genes, make you do something which is bad for you, and your culture may also make you do something which is bad for you. And you see, when I say bad for you, this is a very important question of values. I am looking for a certain kind of immanent criterion, something that you can agree upon from within your head. Oleg spoke about hedonism before the beginning of class. Yes, maybe something like hedonism, feelings of pleasure and pain. You don't need an argument to establish that pleasure and good and pain is bad. Like when you have, think of health. Like when you have a splintering headache or when you have an appendicitis, you don't need an argument which will tell you that this is bad. You know it's bad without an argument. Your body tells you that it is bad, right? And so when I talk about this immanent criterion, let me give you an example, right? So in our evolutionary past, it has been extremely advantageous to have a sweet tooth. We have an evolved preference for sweetness. And notice, evolution is not a designer. Evolution is a tinkerer. Evolution doesn't know why sweet, it's a blind watchmaker, as Dawkins says. The evolution doesn't know why evolving a preference for sweetness is evolutionarily advantageous. It turns out that's because usually, carbohydrates are very dense in calories. Like having a preference for sweetness is a very good idea evolutionarily speaking. Especially like in autumn, you see like a tree with some apples or some fruit, you should want to eat it. You see? So this is kind of a very Freudian thought. Desires are ways of your genes of controlling your behavior, right? So your genes, quote unquote, want, there's an evolutionary pressure for your genes to get into the next generation. And so your genes, regardless of your well-being, make you want sweet things. And in the past, this was advantageous, this was good. Good, advantageous, I don't want to use the word good. Advantageous, it helped get your genes into the next generation. But in the 21st century, where calories are abundant and sugar is abundant, it leads to diabetes and death. You see, something that was adaptive in the past is no longer adaptive because the circumstances have changed and there's not enough time for the genes to catch up. Or you could say that sometimes, parents could be driven to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their children, and this is now in a very straightforward sense. Again, your genes, quote unquote, want you to kill yourselves, to sacrifice yourself for the sake of your children, because this is an evolutionarily advantageous strategy. It's not good for you. You will suffer and die. So from the standpoint of this immanent, egoistic, hedonistic criteria, it's definitely bad for you. But you are driven. You have these desires, and it's like the coronavirus makes you cough, and genes for sexual reproduction make you want to have sex and make you want to sacrifice yourself for your children. But it's the same kind of like external coercive force. So you wouldn't say that, the fact that COVID makes you cough, that coughing is good. In the same fashion, the fact that your genes want you to make you want to have sex doesn't mean that sex is intrinsically good or something like that. And so this is true for biology. This is also now true for culture. And this is why I want to say that from the very beginning of philosophy, there was this very important thematization that culture is very often bad for us. Socrates, in Plato's dialogue Alcibiades, says that the first task of education is to unlearn all the harmful things that society has implanted into you, right? So in terms of cultural evolution, in terms of agriculture, you have this double violence, right? So you imagine you have a king, and they have the violence of the sword, which is why I have metallurgy and agriculture. The king is just a person, but having stocks of grain allows them to hire troops to keep themselves in power. So they have the sword, which is one kind of violence, and there's also another kind of violence, which is religion. So the primitive kind of ideology, which legitimates the rule of the king and says it is actually, let's say God's will, Marduk's will, or Zeus's will, that the king rule over you, right? So there's this kind of double kind of violence that ultimately allows for what? Extraction of surplus. Again, it's like in an important sense, if you think about the long history of the world, what do you care about? You care about calories. peasants produce calories, and these calories can be used to sustain the army. This is the name of the game. I mean, you can legitimately look at the history of humanity as history of war. To a very large extent, it's true. History of humanity is history of war, and it's history of constant competition, constant struggle, right? And most languages that have existed are extinct. Most cultures that have existed are extinct. Most religions that have existed are extinct, right? And again, a long story, and Fukuyama talks about religion as a natural phenomenon. Daniel Dennett talks about religion as a natural phenomenon. But again, this notion of religion as a mechanism for control, as a force multiplier. The king has a law, but punishment, threat of punishment, is not robust enough. It helps stabilize society. It helps stabilize the social bond. It helps make society more efficient if people are not just coerced into obeying the laws, but are also not just coerced by the violence of the sword, but are also coerced by the violence of religion. That if you don't pay taxes, then Marduk is going to torture you after you die. Something like that, right? Or like your soul in Hades will not be able to rest, to rest. And this is why, again, as I'm teaching the course in history of philosophy, I want students to be aware of this, right? So when, like the oldest surviving religious texts, not the Bible is super young by contrast, and there's a story of the Bible, there's a genealogy. We think it was an oral tradition, and we can trace how the stories changed. There was an earlier flood myth, for example, which was somewhat different from the kind of flood myth that we find in the Bible. But anyway, so it's like the oldest surviving religious texts come from the pyramids in Egypt, but also come from India, the Vedas, right? And when we talk about them, I think there are some interesting insights in those texts, and I enjoy reading those texts tremendously. Like in the Vedas, I think in the Rig Veda, at some point the hymn says that at the beginning of time, nobody knows what existed. It was maybe the Brahma, the chief god, but maybe even Brahma doesn't know what existed at the beginning of times. I think it's a very beautiful skeptical element of skepticism there in the Rig Veda, right? And I want to say it's very interesting to look at these texts, but it's also, I feel, important to realize that today, from the standpoint of the 21st century, we see these texts as human constructs. And again, it's always, I often find students, especially first-year students, who come from a very local background and they have never been exposed to other cultures and other religions. But I teach this wonderful course. I have students from China, from Japan, from India, from Germany, from the United States of America, from so many different cultures, religions, people who are Buddhists, Muslims, atheists, different kinds of atheists, etc., etc. And it's like, necessarily, we have to treat these texts as human inventions. And there's a kind of an interesting, again, critical element in philosophy. There's a very uneasy relationship between philosophy and religion. I will remind you that the founder of our discipline, Socrates, was executed by the city of Athens on the charge of impiety, bogохульство. This is kind of this age-old conflict between philosophy and religion, because religion, presumably most religions, or at least most religions that are dominant today, want you to have faith and just accept things on blind faith without an argument, but philosophy wants to question everything. And this premonition, this hunch that actually society is often bad for you, and this is actually what Socrates says in Plato's Dialogues, that Athenian society is bad. If you want to be a good person, you got to live as a private individual, because being engaged in public affairs will corrupt you. Only a corrupt person will prosper in a corrupt society. This is also, you have to understand, so it's a religiously impious thing to say. It's also a politically treacherous thing to say. So there's this very interesting critical element of philosophy. And so this kind of brings me, I'm not exactly sure what kind of conclusion I want to make, but one tentative conclusion I want to make is that, this entire story brings us to the project of enlightenment. Again, so it's like we have immanent values. And again, notice, if somebody tells you that God wants you to suffer, once you have heard this story, you necessarily have to be suspicious. Is it the case that God wants you to suffer? Or maybe your suffering is good for the powers that be, right? Slaves obey your masters, says Paul in the New Testament. Slaves obey your masters. Is that truth from God? Is that good for your soul? Or is that good for Caesar, who decides which books are going to be in the Bible? See? Kind of this skeptical element of philosophy. And I hope also you can see how studying natural sciences, how studying philosophy of physics helps you understand philosophy of religion better. It gives you a certain different kind of perspective, right? But again, I want to say that to the extent that your criterion of goodness is transcendent and says that maybe, it's like, notice, very interestingly, Sprachlichkeit in German, linguisticality. Humans don't just exist, but we also describe our life in a particular way. Again, one of the best sources to read about all of this is actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. Again, he's writing before Darwin, but he's gotten so many things right. Anyway, so Sprachlichkeit, you don't just exist, but you also describe your existence. And once we acquire language, it is possible for you to suffer and to be miserable and yet describe yourself as being righteous, as being good, as being a good person, right? And the critical aspect, the critical element of philosophy, I think, wants to challenge that. And I kept talking about teleological versus mechanistic tradition, and I want to say this is a battle that has been raging on. And the mechanistic philosophers, and on this side of the board, I want to call, to my side, I want to call the Buddha, whom I would call a kind of a hedonist, because cessation of pain is a kind of pleasure. The Buddha, or Epicurus, and actually, I mean, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I mean, Socrates very clearly believes that if you are a good person, you should be happy. Like, if you are unhappy, you are doing something wrong. A good person, really good, excellent person, cannot be miserable. If you are a good person and yet miserable, you're either not really miserable or not really a good person, right? This is sometimes called eudaimonism, from the Greek word eudaimonia, which a certain word that the ancient Greeks used for happiness, right? So you have this immanent criterion that, again, we are thrown into this world, say hi to Heidegger, with certain beliefs, values, desires. And so, like, once you have looked at this story, there is no overarching meaning to human history. There is no overarching meaning to human life. This is the last and the strangest kind of liberation. You have heard Hubert Dreyfus talk about Heidegger in your home assignments. This is the last and the strangest kind of liberation. There's nothing to liberate. There is no achieving higher goal in life. The purpose of psychoanalysis, says Freud, is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary human unhappiness. The best thing that we can hope for is just having life being slightly more palatable. Like, I wake up in the morning, I'm not sure if, skeptical argument in the negative. Do I know that life has no meaning? No, I don't know that. I don't know that for certain. But I do not see any meaning in my life. And you could say, well, if there's no meaning, why don't you throw yourself out the window? Well, because it's painful to throw yourself out the window. I'd rather not suffer, right? In an important respect, Heidegger is going to tell me that my body takes over. My body makes me take care of myself because it's just too painful to not take care of yourself. Again, so I feel this is a very important move that Nietzsche makes. Because values with a capital V are not available to us, we have to make do with small v values. Was liegt an meinem Glücke? Es ist Armut und Schmutz und ein erbärmliches Behagen. Aber mein Glück sollte das Dasein selber rechtfertigen. What matters my happiness? What matters my happiness? It is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. My happiness is not really worth anything in the grand scheme of things. This is, this is the universe. The universe is just, it's an increase in entropy, blind chaos unfolding towards the heat death. There is no end to this story. So my happiness in the grand scheme of things does not matter at all. But my happiness ought to justify existence itself because nothing else can justify existence itself. So capital V values are unavailable to us for skeptical reasons. Maybe they exist, but we don't have access to them. So we have to make do with small v values. And this brings me, again, in an important sense, this is in a nutshell. This is my course in Introduction to Political Philosophy. This is my course into the Introduction to History of Western Philosophy and World Intellectual History. This is also, in a nutshell, my course in Philosophy of Science. It's kind of the most important ideas. What is the upshot? The upshot is that we have a hope. We have a hope. And the hope is Enlightenment Project. Enlightenment Project. And the Enlightenment Project says, starting with philosophers such as the optimists such as Thomas Hobbes and slightly less optimistic Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this idea that there's actually a scientific solution to the problem of society, that I want to be happy and you want to be happy. We have a common human nature. And so we can get together and get rid of the old of the old agricultural superstitions. We can get rid of them and we can reshape the society and we can put it on a scientific basis, create laws which will be good for you and good for me at the same time. Again, the free consent to the rational laws. This is what Jean-Jacques Rousseau actually says. Each nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. I am rational, you are rational, and the laws are rational. So I freely choose to obey the rational laws because they are in my interest. So the reconciliation of the interest of individual with the interest of society. This is maybe the most important idea of Hegel's philosophy of history. Maybe we'll get to Hegel at some point, right? So the reconciliation of the interest of the individual and the interest of society. This is the promise of Enlightenment. This is the hope of the Enlightenment, the project of the Enlightenment. But then there's also the danger, the challenge of the Enlightenment project, because philosophers such as Michel Foucault, first and foremost, are going to say, but is it true? No, actually not just Foucault. Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Foucault. Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Foucault. The hermeneutics of suspicion. Suspicious philosophers, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Foucault, are going to say, is it the case that society really aligns the interests of the individual and the society, or is it the case that society indoctrinates us, lies to us, and misrepresents its interests, whatever they may be, as interests of all? And notice, when I say interests of society, I mean these kinds of structural interests. Efficiency for the sake of efficiency. Again, this phrase, efficiency for the sake of efficiency, this is the dark side of modernity. This is what Marx was afraid of. This is what Weber was afraid of. Heidegger, Emil Durkheim, right? So this is like, for so many modern philosophers, this is the problem. This steam engine of efficiency for the sake of efficiency, which makes everybody a cog in the machine, including you and me, right? Anyway, again, the coercive logic of competition in the market, the coercive logic of the competition between sovereign states. Marx is going to talk about something similar. Again, this idea of ideology, and especially Michel Foucault is going to say, is it the case that somehow magically we find the solution to the riddle of history? This is a phrase from Hegel and from Marx. The solution to the riddle of history, finding rational laws which people obey freely. Is it the case that we have found these laws, or could it be that society simply indoctrinates us? Because again, as, Plato knew about this. People say that Plato was an anti-sophist. I don't think that's the case. Plato decided to preserve the arguments of the sophists, I think, because he was deeply impressed by them. Protagoras, one of the early sophists, says, children are born young and weak, and society, through threats of punishment and spankings and beatings, forces children into a certain kind of mold. So from Protagoras to Freud, who's going to talk about how becoming a member of society, acquiring language, acquiring Sprachlichkeit, is a certain kind of violent process. Jacques Lacan will reinterpret Freud. So again, Freud talks about castration, fear of castration. It's a bit, I want to say, on the surface it sounds a bit naive, but Lacan interprets this metaphorically. He says every child needs to be castrated before they become social. What does it mean to become castrated? Metaphorically speaking, you have to yield to society. You have to accept the terror before society's punishment and say, yes, I am afraid. I am willing to be society's slave. I am afraid what others think of me. Rousseau calls this amour propre. Caring deeply about what others think of me. Can we, again, and this is why the Buddhist project, let's say, is so subversive. Because if you're a monk and you sit in a cave and you don't care, you don't give a flying fuck about what society thinks about you, that's dangerous. That's socially, this is not you, this is not me. We care. I mean, you and me here, if we were to take off our clothes right now, we would die of shame, most of us, not all people, but most of us. We would not be happy. So it's going to be a visceral reaction, right? Anyway, so Foucault is going to say that Foucault, writing in the wake of Marx, is going to say that society needs people to do stupid jobs, to do demeaning jobs, meaningless jobs. Nobody's born, a trash collector. Nobody's born a delivery man. Society forces us into these roles. Not you and me in this class. We have the rare luxury of actually denken, right? Thinking about these things at our own spare time. In many ways, this is a situation free from necessity, right? But for so many people, in fact, I want to say, for the vast majority of people alive on planet Earth today, philosophy is unaffordable luxury. They are forced into these molds. And you say, oh, Project of Enlightenment, people do what they were born to do. Like, we have our rich and varied abilities, and in the hierarchy of talent, you occupy the thing that you are best suited for. And Foucault is going to say, no, the social system has a demand for people to slot into the logic of the division of labor. And so the social system produces us, and this is why Foucault is so important. This is why Foucault speaks not only to the workers, but also to you and me. We are bourgeois. Because even though the workers are disciplined, we, the bourgeois, were also disciplined. Again, I teach in highly prestigious university, very highly prestigious departments, and yet students, what is the dominant emotion of their life? I ask, ask yourself. I ask my first-year students who, wear Gucci and drive Porsche Cayennes. I ask them, what is the dominant emotion of their life? And it's fear. It's fear. For some reason, even though they can afford to not work a single day in their life is dominated by fear. In school, they're afraid that they're going to get bad grades, that they're going to drop out of school, that they're going to be expelled from the university or something like that. Why is our society based on fear? Again, discipline and punish, says Foucault. From Protagoras through Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche to Foucault. Again, this idea of domination. And again, as I told you, this is the promise of modernity, of Enlightenment, and this is the challenge of Enlightenment. The challenge is that this is a lie. The coincidence of the interest of the individual and society is a lie. It's just a facetious lie. But the promise of the Enlightenment is that maybe by me talking about this in a course like this, obviously not single-handedly, but being a part of the conversation, maybe you and me, we can understand this. Maybe you and me as humanity, we can understand this, and somehow we can have the force of the dialogue. Again, go back to Socrates. The only force that a free citizen recognizes is the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. So this is, again, if Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, and Foucault are philosophers of suspicion, philosophers of pessimism, it's going to be Jürgen Habermas, who's probably going to be the last philosopher we're going to talk about in this course. This is the phrase from Habermas, der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. Could it be that humanity will be able to free itself from this coercive logic? Again, this slavery to efficiency, and somehow human beings acquiring self-control. And it's an interesting question, because one thing that actually kind of speaks in Habermas's favor, a hope, not truth, but a hope, is that unless we do this, probably humanity will destroy itself. Because in this drive for efficiency's sake, like prisoner's dilemma, you evolve mechanisms of self-destruction before you evolve the mechanisms to control self-destruction. And unless, so like humanity, it's like as the German socialists like to say, socialism or barbarism. Either humanity will learn to engage in public dialogue, or we will destroy ourselves, one way or another. Again, in 2021, it's not even an interesting proposition. There are so many ways in which humanity can destroy itself through direct, action or just through negligence. Late Stephen Hawking, I remind you, thought that our lack of attention to meteor strikes is the leading problem that humanity faces in the 21st century. I'm not sure if Hawking was right, but it's certainly true that humanity doesn't spend nearly enough resources. Again, if you were to think about this in terms of the Enlightenment project, the social contract, right? Like, you have desires, I have desires, you have things that make you happy, I have things that make you happy. Let's get together, let's make a wish list. Somewhere in this wish list is going to be, we do not want humanity to be destroyed by meteorites. We do not want our children to die before they're born due to meteorite strike, right? And it's going to be, probably it's going to be pretty high on our list. And the only reason why we're not doing this is because actually you and me, the free discussion, this wish list is not in control. What is in control is, again, these anonymous structural forces which are due to natural selection, which is why I have this phrase that human beings are anxious and mostly unconscious products of larger forces of biological and cultural evolution, manufactured by these forces not to be happy or to find meaning in life, but to fulfill a function in the perpetuation of the logic of this system. That the logic is efficiency for the sake of efficiency, and we want things that honestly we don't need, and the things that we really need, like lasting satisfaction, are the things that in principle we cannot get, right? So that's the story. This is another take at the story from protons to presidents and from electrons to elections. A bit of a preview. So let me maybe pause here and see if you have questions.